Bob Dylan was an important figure in the American response during the mid-1960s, but he certainly wasn't the only one that was making a difference in sort of fending off, if you will, the British acts who were so dominating the charts during this period. Often together with the story that we've heard about Bob Dylan in the summer of '65, the Newport Folk Festival, Like a Rolling Stone, and all that went with that, we have to talk about the music of the Byrds, because it's sort of intimate, well, in many ways it's intimately related with what was going on with Dylan. The Byrds started by Roger McGuinn, guitarist, along with David Crosby, Gene Clark, Chris Hillman, and Michael Clark. That group, McGuinn and Crosby, emerged out of the Greenwich Village folk scene as many of the other musicians did. But at this point in time, there's kind of the beginnings of a real migration toward the West Coast in the music business. In fact, between the beginning of the 60s and the end of the 60s, you can really see the music business in this country really, in large part, migrate from New York to Los Angeles. There was a lot of natural attractions to Los Angeles. One of them is the television and the movie business were out there, and so there was a lot of sophisticated people out there who were involved with production. There were good recording studios, this kind of thing. And so McGuinn makes his way out to LA, starts doing his folk routine, his folk act, doing traditional folk songs, and also playing songs, Beatles songs, in his folk act, which I guess was a little bit strange for the day. But you could already see the beginnings of McGuinn wanting to go in the direction of what the Beatles did. The first collection, the first version of the Byrds was called the Beef Eaters, and they used to have a song that they did called Mr. Tambourine Man, which was a Dylan song, but it's a Dylan song that Dylan hadn't yet recorded. He'd done a recording of it, and as the story goes, Ramblin' Jack Elliott had been on the recording they'd done, and something about the playing on it was out of tune, and they decided not to use it. But the guy that was producing the Byrds at the time, Terry Melcher, got a hold of this recording, and the Byrds heard it, and so they started working up this version of Dylan's Mr. Tambourine Man, initially doing it with an acoustic 12-string, very much, like a kind of folk revival group from the first half of the 1960s, New Christy Minstrels or something like that. But then A Hard Day's Night came out in the summer of 1965, and so the guys from the Byrds went to see A Hard Day's Night. First, like everybody else, they were totally enraptured by the Beatles and Beatlemania, and always going that this is fantastic, this is just what we want to do, we want to be just like these guys. But they noticed that in that movie, George Harrison is playing a Rickenbacker 12-string guitar. Now, McGuinn had been playing a 12-string acoustic guitar, but this Rickenbacker electric 12-string had 6 pegs. If you looked at it straight on, had 6 pegs just like a normal guitar, but if you turned it sideways, you would see there were 6 more pegs for the extra 6 strings that added up to 12, and there's George Harrison playing that. Roger McGuinn thought, that's fantastic, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to get a guitar just like that. Well, it turned out Rickenbacker guitars were made right there in Southern California. He was able to go to a music store, and as the story goes, traded in, like, I don't know, an acoustic 12-string and a banjo or something like that for a brand new Rickenbacker guitar. They decided to do their version of Mr. Tambourine Man with that Rickenbacker electric 12-string guitar and that jingly, jangly sound of folk rock, which has been, emblematic ever since in the popular music business. You think about groups like R.E.M., Tom Petty, all that sort of jingle jangle. It all comes from that moment in 1965 when Roger McGuinn picks up the Hard Day's Night guitar and puts it on a Bob Dylan song, right, and plays a little introduction that he says is influenced by Jesu Joy of Man's Desiring by J.S. Bach, puts all these things together and creates this hit single, Mr. Tambourine Man, which goes to #1, released in April of 1965, so just at the same time as Like a Rolling Stone is on the charts. We've also got Mr. Tambourine Man, 2 Bob Dylan songs, interestingly, one song written by Bob Dylan but not performed by him, and one song written by Bob Dylan and performed by him, sort of the 2 sides of what Dylan's career had been up to that point. An interesting element of that song, Mr. Tambourine Man, is not only that it combines a Beatles guitar, a Dylan song, and this Bach-influenced introduction, but also that it uses the same studio band as had worked with Phil Spector on his records. And in fact, it was some of the same guys who'd been on a Beach Boys session for a song called Don't Worry Baby. And when they were putting together Mr. Tambourine Man, these studio musicians remembered this, and Terry Melcher said, can you do the beat, can you do the feel from the Beach Boys tune? So they took the Beach Boys feel from Don't Worry Baby and put it together with what McGuinn already had on the tune, and that's what became Mr. Tambourine Man. You notice I'm talking about a studio band. The only person actually playing on Mr. Tambourine Man is Roger McGuinn from the Byrds. The rest are all studio musicians. The other Byrds members are singing, but in a couple of years when we talk about the music of the Monkees, when the Monkees music comes along in a couple of years, we'll talk about how people thought it was so inauthentic that the Monkees weren't even playing on their own records. But it turns out that when it comes to Mr. Tambourine Man, an iconic folk rock hit of unquestioned authenticity, it turns out that most of the musicians on the recording were studio musicians. Nevertheless, after that, the Byrds played on their own records and had subsequent hits with All I Really Want to Do. There's a fun story that has to do with Cher that I'll tell you about in just a minute. Turn, 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 a Pete Seeger song, which again went to #1 in the fall of '65. And 8 Miles High, which is a song that McGuinn said is about a cross-country airline flight, which would be 7 miles high, but that didn't scan so well as a lyric, so it became 8 miles high. But of course, 8 miles high, everybody thought they were drug lyrics. And so in fact, the song only got as high as #14 in the spring of 1966 and got pushed off the charts because a word went round to radio stations that it was a drug song. It's also very much influenced by the music of John Coltrane. There's a guitar lick on the 12 string at the very beginning, which is a quote directly from a John Coltrane track, India. I think it is there. So that's the story with the Byrds. Is taking this folk thing as Dylan was doing and really sort of turning it into that jingly jangly sound. Speaking of the jingle jangle, and I mentioned before the previous video that the producer Tom Wilson would become an important important part of this discussion. Let's talk a little bit about Simon and Garfunkel and how all that works out for them. Another important group here, coming out of New York City and actually staying in New York City. Well, it turns out that Simon and Garfunkel had actually been a kind of Everly Brothers kind of group back in the late 50s called Tom and Jerry. They had a mild hit with a song called Hey Schoolgirl. They even appeared on American Bandstand, right, as a kind of young teenage version of the Everly Brothers. But then they finished school and did other kinds of things, and then came back as part of the folk revival as Simon and Garfunkel, doing totally acoustic music. Released an album in 1964 called Wednesday Morning 3 a.m. It kind of flopped. It had a song on it called The Sounds of Silence, but it's not the version that you're used to hearing. Anyway, the album flops. Paul Simon goes off to England to sing. I think Art Garfunkel goes to graduate school, whatever, and so they're really not doing Simon and Garfunkel at the time. But when Mr. Tambourine Man hits, and when the Dylan tune hits in the summer of '65, Tom Wilson, the producer, remembers this album, this Wednesday Morning 3 a.m., which was on the same label as Dylan Columbia. And so without the knowledge of Paul Simon or Art Garfunkel, he brings studio musicians into the studio. They take the Sounds of Silence and they add to it electric guitar, bass, and drums. Now, how do you add something to a song that's already recorded? Well, you can tell if you listen to the recording that the first couple of measures of it are the acoustic guitar all by itself. That's how the musicians are able to pick up where the tempo is. And then after a couple of measures, the electric guitar comes in, the bass comes in, the drums come in. And so without their knowledge, this song was re-released in this country and actually became a big hit, a #1 hit in 1965. Imagine being Paul Simon and getting that phone call. Oh, listen, Paul, it's your record company calling. Guess what? You've got a hit in America. What do you mean I've got a hit in America? I don't have any records out in America. Well, and so that's the whole story. And so what Tom Wilson essentially did was took what was an acoustic folk song, added the electric guitars, bass, and drums to it, and really, that's the definition of what folk rock is. Well, Simon and Garfunkel went on to record an album, The Sounds of Silence, and that's the one you're probably familiar with in that version. Other songs like Homeward Bound from 1966 and I Am a Rock really kind of made them one of the most important acts of that era. Also coming out of LA, we've got the Mamas and the Papas. Now they also formed in New York, but again, like we talked about with the Byrds, moved to LA, and they're a little bit latecomers to this folk rock thing. The group led by John Phillips, but having two men in the group and 2 females, so those are the papas and the mamas there, including Mama Cass Elliot, who was sort of, in many ways, the sort of star of the group, although a lot of the songwriting and harmonies, vocal harmonies and arrangements were done by John Phillips, one of the guys in the group. Their big hit, first big hit, California Dreamer, went to number 4 in 1966, and their big number 1 hit from 66 was a track called Monday, Monday. And another thing that began to happen among these folk rock groups is because the Byrds had had so much success covering Dylan songs, other groups either covered Dylan songs or tried to imitate in their songwriting what a Dylan song sounded like. So there was a fellow by the name of Barry McGuire who had a number 1 hit in the fall of 1965. So this is kind of just in months after the emergence of folk rock and Mr. Tambourine Man. This track is called Eve of Destruction. And the guy who wrote the song, P.F. Sloan, was essentially given the assignment, I think it was by Lou Adler at the record company, to basically write a song that sounded like a Dylan song that wasn't a Dylan song. So he wrote Eve of Destruction. Barry McGuire had a number 1 hit with that one. The Turtles, another group from L.A., covered the Dylan song It Ain't Me Babe and had a number 8 hit with that in 1965. The Turtles, made up of dual singers Mark Volman and Howard Kalin, would later be known as Fluorescent Leach and Eddie, or Flo and Eddie, when they appeared on Frank Zappa albums and then had their own solo career in the 70s. But early on they were the Turtles. It Ain't Me Babe is a fantastic tune, but Happy Together, their number 1 hit from slightly later, 1967, is one of the classic American pop hits from the 1960s. So this in many ways wraps up our discussion of folk rock, but there were other elements of the American response that we can talk about in the 1960s. And in the next video, we'll turn to the legacy of Phil Spector.